I think Ms. Meng has quite a strong case. I never expected that we would have this problem thrown at us.
Our focus is entirely on getting those Canadians home safe and making sure that all their rights are respected.
If I were Prime Minister, I would fire John McCallum.
Okay, mixed messages on China. Canada's ambassador makes some bold statements, as you heard there, and then takes them back. So did John McCallum go rogue? And how are these foreign policy issues, these big issues like this feud with China, continuing to make life difficult for the government? At Issue is here to tackle these questions and more. Chantal Hébert is in Montreal. Andrew Coyne is in Ottawa tonight, and Eric Grenier also in Ottawa. Okay, let's start with the John McCallum and the apology. I just want to read viewers a part of it that struck me. Here's what he said in his statement. He says, I misspoke. These comments do not accurately represent my position on this issue. As the government has consistently made clear, there has been no political involvement in this process. Andrew, do you buy that?
Well, it's difficult to believe that it doesn't represent his position. I suppose the question is, does it represent the government's position? There are three possibilities here. One is that he was completely going rogue, taking a position at odds with the government. The second is that he was speaking for the government. This was the message they intended to convey. They now deny that. The third is that this represents something in the government's thinking that they would rather was not discussed publicly, and that is worth, I think, continuing to explore. If the suggestion, leave aside the impugning the integrity of the extradition process and seeming to line up with the arguments of the Chinese government, even as they're holding 3 Canadian hostages, if the suggestion was, and I think it was, that at the end of the day, after the court has ruled, when it comes across the minister's desk who has final say on the extradition treaty, that there'd be some deal we'd be willing to strike where we would refuse to extradite her, even though she was otherwise worthy of being extradited, solely to get those hostages back. That seems to me to be doing a deal under the threat. That seems to me to be paying ransom for hostages, which is something I don't think government should be doing. So I think there are still more questions to be asked here about exactly who he was speaking for here.
Just to be clear, when Andrew's talking about hostages, he's talking about the 2 men that have been detained under charges that we do not know. There's been no due process, and then a 3rd man who has now been sentenced to death in that case for drug trafficking. And Andrew's calling them hostages for political reasons, I would imagine. Chantal, your perspective on all of this.
I tend to believe that McCallum went off message, that he overshot, that he was on a mission to say we have a system where the decks are not stacked against the person that is being asked to be extradited, but that he got carried away and unveiled his cards. The reason I don't buy that he was on a mission to send the message that he's now walking back is that this is the kind of thing that, as an ambassador speaking for the government of Canada, he could have said privately to Chinese authorities. He did not need to go to Markham to call in some Chinese-speaking reporters to, ta-da, unveil this position. It may reflect something the government of Canada is ready to do, but in any event, the venue does not suggest that that is where it should have happened.
It at very least reflects how difficult the file is, Eric, that you can't, that if you make one misstep on these issues with China, you can be in big trouble.
Yeah, absolutely. And when I look at an issue like this, I tend to see it as I see a lot of different things through the prism of the upcoming election. And when you think about the domestic considerations that might have gone through either McCallum's own decision to do this, go rogue, like Andrew said, is one of the possibilities, or if this was somehow in conjunction with the government or the Liberal Party, for McCallum to invite Chinese language media, both from China and from Canada, and go to Markham, that is a media outlet, and those media outlets have a huge reach across the country. And the Chinese-Canadian community is an important electorate for the Liberals, for the Conservatives. There are 19 ridings across the country where they make up at least 20% of the population, and they're all in the battlegrounds in Vancouver, in Toronto. John McCallum, because he was a former Liberal MP for the Markham area, he has a lot of credibility on this file, and he's not only someone who's speaking for the government, he's someone who would be seen as speaking as a Liberal, not just as some public servant. So I think that consideration has to be taken into account as well, that McCallum might have felt, or the Liberals might have felt, that they might have not been coming off as very sympathetic to Ms. Meng's plight. and that for a lot of voters who, Chinese Canadians, would not have a uniform view on this, that idea of at least sympathy that Ms. Meng was somehow put in the middle of a spat between the United States and China, that maybe someone communicating that the government understood that sympathy, maybe there was some electoral considerations at play.
I don't doubt for a second that McCallum must have run through his meeting with those journalists somewhere. But what does it say? And I'm not terribly fascinated by how the electoral calculations of the Liberals on this, except to note that a week after they lost a candidate to appealing to a specific community, it's a bit rich to then go back to the electoral drawing board and use your ambassador, who is the points person in a major foreign policy dispute, to spread the good word of the Liberal government. But I am interested in the question of what does it say about John McCallum, the ambassador, that he cannot fulfill a mission and not cross the line in a briefing with journalists in Markham.
We pay diplomats to be discreet. I think what's as significant as who was invited to that press conference is who wasn't invited, which is the entire national media. And why exactly, I don't know, but that's another question I think that has to be answered in this affair. Whether or not, what he intended to signal is an interesting question. I think Chantal makes a good case about, maybe he wasn't intending to signal quite as much as he did. But what he unintentionally signaled, I think, is also important. And what it signals about what the government's thinking is significant and worth digging into, but also what unintended signals this might be sending to the Chinese. And what's really worrisome to me in this is when you have these really tense situations where, and I'm not the only one who calls these people hostages. It's the consensus of the foreign policy community that these are essentially, this is hostage diplomacy China is practicing. At such a moment, to be sending such confused signals from the government, advertently or inadvertently, is really troublesome. And if he was given authorization to say this, that's troublesome in one way. And if he did it on his own, that's also troublesome and certainly calls into question whether he should be our ambassador to China.
So even with, the retraction then, is that enough to put things right here? Can he go back to China and continue the work that he was doing to try and get these Canadians released? Eric, you go first there.
Well, I mean, I really can't say if it'll be enough. When you see how the government was reacting first to McCallum's comments, where it was very hard to get a statement out of the Prime Minister when he was asked about it, when we saw him, I believe it was earlier today, not exactly giving McCallum a complete support, suggested the government was still pretty uncomfortable about this. And, to say that he misspoke when he went on, it was a 40-minute session with the media. I mean, it's hard to believe that McCallum himself would have been really the one who really wanted to get out there and make this statement.
Yeah, I mean, I can't remember. I mean, my memory is probably not as good as everyone else's, but I can't remember a time when an ambassador has had to do that kind of thing, walk back public comments on an issue that is this delicate with another country. That seems to me pretty incredible.
And if this is the preview, and I don't know, but if this is the preview of the pretext of the arguments that the government would make for the minister nixing the extradition, that, we don't support the sanctions process, for example.
Right, for the justice minister at the end of the extradition process to sign off one way or the other, yep.
But that's the other thing, is the arguments that the ambassador was trotting out here are thin and contentious at best. I think a lot of people would say they don't actually stand up to analysis. They're arguable, but they're not airtight by any means. And if these are the arguments that they're going to make to cover up what it would be a fairly transparent deal, then that doesn't speak well to this government's reasoning or its understanding of the extradition law itself, for example.
It also puts the new justice minister, lucky him, Mr. Lametti, in a more difficult position, because it's going to be awfully hard, whichever way he comes down now, to continue to argue that this is not a political decision, that he's only following the process, and that now that the courts, if that is what is going to happen, have said yes to the U.S. application for extradition, then he can't see a reason not to go ahead with it, or in the reverse, blocking it. These words will continue to hang over whatever happens at the end of that process.
I only have like $1.30 left. Let's see if we can do it. Because China wasn't the only issue. I just want to do one quick go around on the issue of Venezuela. Canada had a pretty clear position with the United States and some other countries around the world today around the self-endorsed leader, but the NDP had a very different view, and it was manifested in a number of ways today. Here's the new NDP candidate, Sven Robinson.
It is shameful that the government of Canada and Justin Trudeau is lining up with Donald Trump, with the authoritarian thug Bolsonaro, the president of Brazil, and is in fact recognizing a coup.
Okay, very quickly. So Jagmeet Singh's position, not exactly as extreme as that, but certainly not what the government's position is. Nikki Ashton, fairly out there as well. Just a quick go-around on what you think of the strategy. Chantal?
I was curious to see that the candidates and MPs now speak before the foreign affairs critic or the leader on a major foreign policy issue. And I do note the distance between the official statement from Singh and those statements we just heard. And to me, that suggests that maybe the position within the caucus that we have heard from Sven Robinson is not as unanimous or as strong as what he expressed.
Andrew?
It may be leadership politics already rearing its head in the NDP ranks. It's also, you've got people on the far left of the NDP who have always been soft on the Chavez regime, now the Maduro regime in Venezuela, which is a dictatorship, which is a kleptocracy, which is rejected by millions of Venezuelans. Look, nobody likes lining up with Donald Trump. What they conveniently fail to mention is 9 or 10 other members of the Organization of American States, the Lima Group, which is a pro-democracy group in South America that we are a part of, that we are trying to support. This isn't lining up with Donald Trump. This is lining up with the pro-democracy forces in that region.
Eric, quickly.
Yeah, not just in the Western Hemisphere, Germany as well, recognizing that new leader. And I think it exposes two things. One, the divides that are still within the NDP between the further left flank and maybe the more centrist flank, and also just the weakness of the leadership and the caucus relationship with that leadership, that they can't get a single message out. And we're not able to really put anybody out in front of a camera who could express the party's actual position on this file.
And then the Singh didn't bother doing it himself either in front of a camera. Okay, thanks everybody. Before we go, be sure to subscribe to @Issue the podcast. Extra content there. This week we're looking ahead to the upcoming session of Parliament, the last one before the election probably. Look for it at iTunes, any major podcast app, our website. Hey, that's the new Parliament.